Welcome back, everyone. My name is Kevin Wagner, and I'll be the FMCS facilitator for the afternoon and also for the public comment section, which will begin at 3:30. Looks like everyone has their naming conventions correct. I know we were talking about distance ed as we went into lunch, and I do see a hand. Joe, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to call a caucus to discuss the asynchronous clock hour issue and bringing back an approach. I would like to ask the following people to be in that caucus: Denise Morelli, David Musser, Joe Ellen Price, Zach Goodwin, Jamie Studley, Erica Linden, Scott Dolan, Laura Racer King, Jillian Klein, David Cohen, Michael Cioce, John Ware, Rob Anderson, Jessica Morales, and Emmett Blaney. "15 minutes.
Brady, do you need anything repeated on that list?
I think I got them all, but Joe, I'll add you last, and you can correct me if any you see any stragglers.
Can I ask a quick? Can I make a request though about that? Did I hear Greg Martin's name on the list of department folks who would be included, or not?
No.
If so, if not, I think Greg should be included from the department if Denise and I are.
Okay.
Brady, do you have everybody? Just want to make sure.
I do. Yeah, I'm going to start adding folks to room 7 now, so you should see an invite momentarily. And again, if I forget anyone, Joe, I'll add you last. Just feel free to remind me.
Okay, so we can go ahead and pause the live stream.
Welcome back. It's 1:28 Eastern, and the caucus is back in the main room. Is there anything that anyone would like to report out that was in the caucus?
Yeah, so I'll just say that we had a good conversation and really appreciated the department staff engaging in this discussion about asynchronous and its definition and how that's going to impact programs moving forward. Of course, quality is the most important aspect, and that is a concern here as well, and we recognize that. And then also the department said that they had concerns about how to enforce some of these emerging issues. We also talked about utilizing best practices and engaging stakeholders in this conversation. And so with that, I'll ask David Musser if he would like to share more information from the department's perspective. Thank you.
Thanks,
Sure.
Joe.
Thanks, Joe. So I do appreciate the discussion that we just had. The department, in evaluating the original proposal that we received to put a limit on the percentage of a program that could be offered through asynchronous clock hours, as I mentioned, we didn't think that was sufficient, given that the department's concerns are really focused on asynchronous clock hours generally, and 50% is a significant portion of the program. We don't think that a percentage threshold would work. However, we heard from the committee that there were a number of folks who were interested in offering alternative guardrails to this that could help with some of the department's concerns. And I wanted to reiterate sort of what our concerns are here. So we're primarily concerned with the use of asynchronous technology to count clock hours toward a student's Title IV eligibility when there is no academic engagement or active learning happening at the student level. That could take a variety of forms, and there is an incentive for schools that might be cash-strapped to do that in order to avoid having to use complicated technology to track every single clock hour. So the department's concern is first narrowly focused on that, meaning how you ensure that the hours that are counting toward Title IV eligibility, which are intended to be part of active engagement and learning by the student, include that level of engagement and are being monitored appropriately by the institution. So the student can't just push a button and walk away and get 6 hours of credit toward their next Title IV disbursement. The larger issues of academic quality sort of blossom from that narrow concern, because if a school is allowing students to earn clock hours simply by pushing a button and watching some videos, or not watching it in the worst case scenario, that calls into question the strength of the program and what the student is really gaining from that experience. Now, we heard some concerns about fully discontinuing asynchronous clock hours. The department proposed that because we were unable to come up with guardrails, for example, on the technical side, that would be effective at preventing the things that we're concerned about, while also not being so complicated that they're almost impossible to enforce and difficult even for schools to implement. So we are open to suggestions about reasonable guardrails that could mitigate the department's concerns in this area. Those could be technical, although, as I mentioned, the department has concerns about things being too complicated, so we wouldn't want to have too much in that respect. But they're also related to the difficulty of enforcing this requirement, which is highly technical, requires a lot of resources to ensure whether a school is doing it well, and frankly, requires someone with expertise to go in and actually ascertain whether a school is doing it. But I think there's a recognition from the community that could maybe be accomplished through other organizations having more upfront reviews of this process, evaluating it at regular intervals in some way. So we're open to those sorts of things as well if there are suggestions from negotiators regarding how these concerns could be mitigated. So for all those reasons, the department is willing to postpone the consensus vote on this topic until Thursday. If negotiators indicate that they are interested in providing those kinds of alternatives by Wednesday at noon, so that we can evaluate them, make decisions, and then come back the next day. Now, one other thing I want to mention, the department's current proposal only prohibits asynchronous clock hours. It does not prohibit synchronous clock hours. So make sure that you focus on that with any recommendations that you make.
Barmack, go ahead. You have the floor.
I appreciate the department's open mind, and I certainly will strive to keep a similarly open mind. But I have to tell you, this may be a wild goose chase, because what we are talking about is the substitution of some sort of amorphous, unspecific technology, somewhat better than recorded videos, for instruction. And as you just pointed out, Dave, we are talking not about a traditional curriculum in which recordings, interactive CBT-based language training, whatever, could be just a component of the broader package, but we're talking about a program that is literally measuring by the hour and is seeking to replace instruction time with canned content. And and once again, technology is being invoked as a utopian solution with no specificity as to exactly what it is that is being used to substitute for actual faculty interaction. We'll keep an open mind, but this is sort of like attempting to regulate, agreeing that something is wrong, and I'm just no aspersion on this concept, but it's sort of like trying to create ethical bribery. The concept is incompatible. You either have instruction or you don't. And if you don't have instruction, you don't have instruction. This doesn't mean these programs can't use YouTube. Yes, there's plenty of good value-added content online, and people should be directed to them as adjuncts, as additional support material. But that does not allow somebody to charge tuition on the taxpayer's nickel and the student's nickel for canned content. So we'll be open to see what kind of a technological solution is going to overwhelm the obvious here, and we can vote on Thursday, but I just find it very problematic that the department is even considering anything but cleaning up this mess by saying instruction is instruction. Thank you.
Scott, go ahead.
I mean, I went back and forth on whether I would even respond. Barmack, I understand your perspective, but I think we also need to have a very frank conversation about how learning occurs and how the delivery of content, including the curation of that content, is a component, right? Contact hours, 1 hour of direct instruction for every 2 hours outside of the classroom. A book, which is a technological advancement, is canned content that has been created to transmit knowledge. Instruction would be, I choose which books you should read. I assess how well you understand that book, and I look at that book alongside all of the other books that I've assigned within my classroom. We're talking about innovation around teaching and learning, of which technologies of all kinds have helped us provide more and more access than we've had previously. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't also be paying really close attention, which you've raised on a number of occasions, to the quality and the outcomes associated with those experiences. But let's talk about that. Because inputs can come from a variety of different perspectives, and we can use technology in really exciting and innovative ways to support students in ways that we haven't previously. So that's my only response.
Thank you, Scott. Barmack, your hand's up.
Very briefly, Scott, I understand. Yes, there is plenty of knowledge in books. Curated content in the old days used to be called the curriculum, not instruction. We're playing, DC can weigh in on this one. Are we playing semantic games here? I think we are. You know, the library, the Great Library of Alexandria was a library. It wasn't the University of Alexandria. Just because you have canned content in books, on tape, on servers, on YouTube, that does not make it a learning facility. It makes it a repository of information, and it's disorganized or it's curated, and curation has a value. It's called a curriculum. It is not instruction.
Yeah, we're not removing instructors from these programs. We're active engagement, where we're saying that this would be a component, as a supplement, right? So that's the conversation. I look forward to working.
No, I agree with that. That's great.
If
If you do that, we're on the same page, but you're trying to count the hours when the instructor is absent as hours of instruction. That's the problem. Otherwise, I have no objection to having 150 hours, 300 hours, 600 hours of instruction with massive amounts of additional support being wrapped around it. That's not the issue. It's whether that minimum number, that 600 hours, is instruction time or all the support stuff around the mark.
So I appreciate your openness to a compromise.
Denise, I see your hand up.
I just wanted to keep everybody's focus too, that we're talking about clock hour programs, right? There is a difference between clock hour programs, traditional clock hour programs, which are the hands-on programs, and other, the credit hour programs, which might be the lengthier degrees that you get in various areas. And then in the students that I've dealt with, and I've spoken to hundreds of students, and not just for this issue, but somebody brought it up in the caucus. They're paying for a program, right? And they're paying for a hands-on program. And a lot of times we're talking cosmetology, you're talking HVAC, you're talking a bunch of different things like that we're dealing with here. So I just want to make sure everybody remembers that we are talking about a specific set of programs and not everything. And that these, a lot of times, are talking about hands-on instructions necessary for them to get a job in the field, for them to pass a licensure exam. So I just wanted to make sure everybody remembers that we are focused on a set programs.
We'll say that hands-on is necessary but not sufficient, right? So when I teach an electrical engineer, I don't tell them to go use electricity right away. I ask them to read a little bit about how that operates in practice and abstract and theory, right? So there are theoretical and didactic components to this work, and that supplements the hands-on stuff. So I understand completely the programs that we're talking about. I'm just saying that, the learning that we can use as an input can come in a variety of different forms. So I appreciate it.
Appreciate the discussion. I'm going to hand it over to Greg. Greg, where should we go from this point in light of the postponement?
Okay, well, first of all, David, do you have anything else you want to discuss with respect to distance education before we move on?
No, I think we're good. Thank you, Greg.
Okay, a couple things here. The department's going to request a brief caucus before we begin state authorization. Before I do that, there were a couple of issues that were on the table generally before we broke for lunch, and one was a request that the department consider whether we would, instead of taking consensus by topic or by issue paper, whether we would specifically for distance education be willing to take consensus votes on individual sections of that issue paper, of that topic. And our response to that is that no, we are going to continue to take consensus votes based on the entire topic. Our reasons for that are first of all, that we feel that doing anything else would violate the spirit of negotiations, and we don't look at whenever we propose language on a specific topic, we don't look at it in terms of just you can accept one line or not another line, or I'll take this but not that. We look at it holistically, so we believe that it is necessary to and desirable to take the consensus vote on each topic. So although I can certainly appreciate the concerns voiced and that it might be possible to where consensus could not be reached on an entire topic, to reach it on various parts, but for all the reasons mentioned, I don't think that's an advisable way to go. So we're going to stick with consensus on each topic. The other question we had was once these negotiations are concluded, would it be possible for negotiators to continue to submit documentation to Ed for consideration? The negotiations are, in order for the negotiations to be done in good faith, they need to be completely transparent. And that's what this negotiation process is all about, so that during that process, everybody, not just those of us on the committee, but the public, all concerned individuals, can hear what's being discussed. The department takes great pains during this process not to discuss these matters with people outside of these negotiating sessions. Once the negotiations are concluded, they're concluded. There is no more negotiated rulemaking as part of the process. At that point, we move on to putting together a notice of proposed rulemaking, and then there will be an opportunity for people to comment on those proposed rules. At that time, once these negotiations are ended, there's no restriction on anybody sending anything to us that they want to. We do have another mechanism where parties can request meetings with us to give us their viewpoints on certain topics. However, the negotiation process will end on Thursday, such that the department would not be taking additional submissions and using those the way we do during the negotiation process. So with that said, we are going to take a 15-minute caucus for the department to have some discussions prior to state off. I'm sorry, David, do you have something you want to add?
Yeah, apologies, Greg, real quick.
No problem.
So I heard in the chat from several negotiators who wanted to return to some language about the virtual location concept. So let me ask you, actually, Greg, do you want to do that before we caucus between issues?
I think so. If there are other areas of distance to be discussed, I think we should discuss those before we go to the caucus. So,
okay.
Certainly.
So then actually I'll have Vanessa bring up the language around virtual locations so that we can take a look at that as we talk, and then I'll just remind everyone quickly what the proposal here is. The proposal is to add a definition under the definition of an additional location that refers to a virtual location in which the institution offers 100% of an educational program through distance education or correspondence courses, notwithstanding requirements for students to complete on-campus or residential periods of 90 days or less. And I'll turn it back over to the committee for additional comment on this.
Any comments? Jamie, I see your hand. And you're muted.
I would defer to the institutions who understand this better, but I'm just trying to tell on this virtual location. My understanding was that it was so that the department could get information about outcomes and performance of students who are pursuing their education in a distance form, and that it was primarily or entirely a pathway to subdivide the population and understand the outcomes. But I've been asked whether this would be needed, given that through another provision that we just looked at, the department would be getting a new kind of reporting about distance students and their outcomes. Is this addressing the same problem? Is this still needed, or is this virtual provision here necessary for the department to get the information that it's looking for to understand the results for student achievement from distance education programming? It's the articulation of this and the provision that we worked on this morning.
Thanks, Jamie. So the virtual location proposal was intended to achieve, I guess I would say, 3 different ends. The first one, which is probably the biggest one, is the one that you just mentioned, which was to obtain better information about individuals that were enrolled in distance education, so that we could better understand which programs they were in, where they were actually from, all of those kinds of things that were related to enrollment in a fully distance education program. However, we also have a separate concern about cases where an institution ends all of its distance education offerings. There have been some reports that some institutions are relying heavily on outside providers of resources that are used to provide online programs. If one of those providers ceased to exist suddenly, a school could find itself in a position where it's not offering distance education at all anymore. It doesn't have the capability of doing so, which in that case, under the concept that we were proposing, the students who were in those distance education programs when they were abruptly discontinued could qualify for closed school discharges. That is the main secondary, but still very, very important piece that we were trying to accomplish with the concept of a virtual location. And that cannot be accomplished with merely obtaining information about students at the student level through, for example, NSLBS enrollment reporting. The third one is really an understanding of the reach of fully online programs, which is, and that kind of fits into the very first one, but it is a sort of separate consideration. The department wants to understand where schools are providing their programs. And it's hard to know that by simply knowing how much the student took in a particular semester or a particular period. Knowing that they are enrolled in a fully online program tells us more about that than the other piece. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dave. I did want to mention that David Cohen was in for Jillian, representing proprietary institutions, and he has his hand up. So go ahead, David.
Just in the construct of the David, just in the construct of the earlier requirement, or that the department was seeking, that accreditation visits include all locations and branches. It would be the department's expectation that we would be visiting every online location as well, now that we'd be forming virtual campuses or considering them as separate locations?
No. I think we did briefly talk about this. I don't think we got into much detail in an earlier session, but the department's intent here is that whatever requirements you're subject to currently with your accreditor and your state in order to offer distance education, and the department, which has a much more limited requirement, you would still need to meet. And by meeting those and documenting that you've met those in the way that you currently do, you meet the requirement. There's no requirement for example, a separate accreditation visit to a virtual campus. The requirements for distance education for oversight of this remain the same. That's the intent here. So this was primarily a mechanism, as I mentioned, of doing those two broad things: improving our understanding of students who are enrolled in distance education and receiving Title IV funds, and ensuring that they can qualify for closed school discharges. Yeah.
And would it change your perspective if the online was run out of a separate building in a separate location, or doesn't change that analysis? Okay.
No.
Thank you.
I want to quickly respond to a comment by Scott that the mention of third-party providers that provides more context than what we provided in January. We did mention in our original issue paper that closed school discharges were part of our rationale for developing virtual locations, and that sudden closures of distance education programs were an important piece of that. In recent months, it's become clearer in the news that third-party providers may in fact not always be available to institutions that rely on them. And also, it's not just that. It's certainly that institutions may decide to discontinue a distance education offering themselves. It's really both of those things that we're concerned about from the student perspective, where we want to ensure that they get similar protections to what students get when their physical location closes.
All right, thanks, Dave, for the follow-up on that one. Is there any other new comments related to virtual location language? Okay, I don't see any hands and, oh, one hand, there we go, Jamie. Oh, maybe not. Jamie, you're on mute.
Simply that the word location might be misleading. Just following up on David's comment, I wonder if there's some way to either call it a word that's not used anywhere else, or indicating that it doesn't trigger any other place that refers to location. So otherwise we'll be counting locations and getting these in a way that could be confusing.
Thanks, Jimmy. Yeah, we also, I think, very briefly discussed this earlier, but it probably deserves some additional discussion, especially in the accreditation context. I don't think we can change the term as it's used here, because that is the key term that allows us to qualify students for discharges under the closed school regulations. However, we could be clearer in the accreditation rules that these are not among the locations that accreditors have to evaluate using the same requirements that they do for all locations.
Right. You might also consider whether you want them counted or not counted when you get, for example, how many additional locations does your favorite school here have? Do you want to get these, a report of these data, the things that you're creating for data purposes, or would that throw off your understanding of the nature of the field? I'll leave it there, you get it.
Okay, yeah, and I would mention that we do say physical locations in the accreditation rules to try to distinguish between these two things so that we don't get too much confusion there. Other comments on this language?
I don't see any hands. Dave, Greg, we last spoke with you. You had requested a 15-minute caucus for the department before we dive into state authorization. Do you still want to do that now?
Yes, please.
Okay, so we can stop. Barma, can you hold that comment, or is it something related to the?
Related, in the interest of saving time, a group of us would appreciate an opportunity at the end of the department's caucus to meet with the department. This way things will go more quickly instead of coming back and making the request at that point.
Okay, thanks.
Can I just send the list to you, Kevin, and then request that department? Thank you.
Yep. And
just Kevin, hang on, Barmack, let Brady set up. He's got the caucus for the department, but could you, before we break live stream now, call off the names of the people who you want to meet with the department, so it's a matter of record, so the public that's viewing is aware.
Thanks, Cindy.
Of course. Of course. So I would request that the group include myself, Carolyn, Emmett, Diana, and Robin. And also the alternates as appropriate.
In the department or no?
And the department, obviously. You know, we want to join the department, yes.
Gotcha.
So
Greg, we can talk to each other all the time.
Greg, from the department side, when you're finished with your caucus, then Barmack's requested this caucus with the department. Who would you want in that?
Barmack, was your intent? Barmack's calling it. Were there specific individuals at the department you wanted, Barmack, besides me?
I defer to you, but the topic will be state authorization. So all the appropriate colleagues are welcome to join.
All right, Cindy. Well, then it would be me. It would be Denise Morelli, and I'll also include David Musser in that as well.
Okay.
And it'll be very brief, no more than 10 minutes, I don't think.
That's fine.
So I'm going to ask that I think for the ease of this, that when you're done, Greg, with your department caucus, come back to this room and we'll move you into the other room at that point in time.
Okay. That's fine.
Just so the public knows what the process is going to be while we're pausing the live stream. Okay?
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. It's 2:35 Eastern, and we had two caucuses that just took place. And before we get started on state authorization in between, I did see that Jamie had a question on virtual location. Jamie, do you still have a question related to that before we move on? Okay. See Jamie. All right. It is in the chat. And in that case, since there were a couple caucuses, would the participants that were and the negotiators that were in the caucuses like to report out on those caucuses?
I requested the second caucus with the department and of student consumer advocacy groups. Throughout the negotiations on this topic, we have heard concerns about institutions with regard to state authorization and the sort of expansion of authorization requirements to many more institutions. In the spirit of compromise, we have submitted something that the committee should have. Carolyn Fast submitted a set of proposals on our behalf to the committee. I think they have been distributed, but we just wanted to explain to the department that the purpose of our proposal is to attempt to relieve the largest number of institutions where we have seen the fewest types of challenges and problems from the state authorization mandate. So the two categories that we have suggested to the department would include institutions recognized through state legislation. Currently, there is a 5-year sunset on those institutions being deemed authorized. We want to make sure that the states have the option of recognizing institutions through political acts like that, like legislation or granting of charters. And the other has to do with the founding of the institution, the history of the institution's participation in these programs. Currently, there is a 20-year timeline with a 5-year sunset being proposed. We suggested to the department that institutions founded prior to the enactment of the Higher Education Act of 1965 should simply be allowed to be exempted permanently. Obviously, we don't want to circumscribe the state's right to require particular authorization requirements, but we also want to enable the states, if they so choose, to exempt institutions that have existed prior to 1960, to the enactment of the Higher Ed Act, provided that there has not been a change of ownership, because we do not want institutional founding dates to be sold like taxicab medallions. We want to make sure that the institution that was founded has remained essentially unchanged in terms of its control and ownership. So those are the two exemptions we're proposing. We are also, now this is a little more complicated. We are suggesting that, and we can share some data with the committee on this. We noticed that the number that the department has placed in terms of the ceiling on utilization of reciprocity for institutions based on enrollment is 500. We ourselves had even thought in terms of larger numbers before this, but we did some research, and it turns out that the footprint of the vast majority of institutions is actually far smaller than that. And again, we think the whole point of reciprocity is to enable a minor participation or incidental footprint of institutions, so that, you know, a tiny liberal arts college that happens to have 2 students in a given state isn't forced to go directly to obtain authorization from that state, or a community college that may have a particularly appealing program that happens to attract, you know, 5 students from another state shouldn't have to go seek direct authorization. We want to make sure that the reciprocity mechanism is really intended as a convenience for those purposes, as opposed to as a backdoor to direct authorization from the state. So we are proposing that the number be dropped to whatever is appropriate. Based on our digging, we think even 100 may be the right number in a given state, but we would encourage the department to do its own research and pick a number that makes sense to to exempt institutions that don't purposefully go through reciprocity simply to circumvent direct oversight, to take advantage of reciprocity without undermining the state's right to regulate delivery of education to the various state residents. So that's the suggestion. One adjunct to that suggestion is that as we plug more institutions into direct authorization, we have suggested kind of a runway of a few years to enable the states to enact appropriate rules to ensure that there is a mechanism for out-of-state institutions to obtain direct authorization. Some states don't have those mechanisms, and it takes some time to put those things in place. The department has not reacted to any of our proposals, nor did we expect them to react. We just wanted them to understand what we were doing and why. And again, all of this was in our proposal submitted to the entire committee, but we wanted to make sure that the department kind of took note of our attempt here. Thank you.
Thank you, Barmak. All right. In light of that, Greg, would you like to get started with state authorization?
Sure. Before I do that, I just wanted, because as far as the department's caucus went, our caucus
Sure.
was basically just to discuss the fact that the proposal Barmak just referenced had been submitted to us. So just to apprise all the ed people that it was there and just to look at it. But then subsequent to that, they had requested a caucus with us. It was pretty much on the same thing. So with that, we'll begin our discussion of state authorization. We've got a little less than an hour because we do have to go to public comments at 3:30, but we can get started with state authorization. I'm not optimistic about concluding within the next 45 minutes, so the discussion will begin again tomorrow. We do have, we originally had TRIO scheduled for first thing tomorrow, and I don't know exactly what we're going to do with the schedule there, whether we'll continue this discussion tomorrow prior to TRIO or break for TRIO. So I'll wait for confirmation from my people behind the scenes as to how that will work, but we will start with state authorization this afternoon, and I see Vanessa has pulled up the paper here. I'll give everybody a chance to get that up for them. We have made a number of significant changes to the regulatory text in state authorization based on the previous proposals that we did receive. And to clarify our intent, since there was some confusion related to what went on in session 2, and I will do that. But at first, I want to walk through some of these changes, and then we'll address some of the questions that came up during the sessions, the previous sessions, before opening it up to discussion. So the first place I want to start here is in A1, 600.9A1. Let's go there. Okay, thank you, Vanessa. So under A1, we clarified the language to say that the department considers an institution legally authorized in the state if the state requires the institution to comply with the applicable state authorizations or licensure requirements and applicable state laws and regulations. Remember that we addressed the exemptions and reciprocity separately in its own section. So let's take a look at the actual language here. And you can see here that an institution described under 600.4, 600.5, and 600.6 is legally authorized by a state if the state requires the institution to comply with any applicable state authorization or licensure requirements and all applicable state laws and regulations. Let's next move to 600.9A3. Thank you, Vanessa. Here we addressed the exemptions. We clarified the language. Where under existing regulations, certain institutions may be exempted based on accreditation or years in operation. We've clarified the language to say that these exemptions will expire on July 1, 2030. This is the same proposal from session 2, but there was some confusion about the way the language was written. Finally, we've added language that for institution that is currently exempt from requirements undergoing a change of ownership, the institution must get approval from their state, the state rather, where it is considered authorized, and seek initial approval for state authorization. As mentioned previously, this has been an ongoing concern for the department since our regulations require institutions get approval from their state for a change in ownership. But because the institution is exempted, this required approval is not occurring. For these institutions, they will not They will not get until 2030. They will be required to go through initial approval as part of the change of ownership. Again, we did not deal with reciprocity in this section and instead address everything pertaining to reciprocity in its own section. So let's just take a look here at the actual language in 600.9A3, the additional language we have here. And let me just start that. Okay. And yeah, arrow down a little bit there, but that's to where we start with the new language, right? So you can see there, the institution may be exempted from requirements for initial or renewed application for authorization or licensure if a charter, statute, constitutional provision, or other action issued by an appropriate state agency or state entity establishes the institution by name as an educational institution and authorizes it to operate educational programs beyond secondary education, including programs leading to a degree or certificate, though this exemption shall expire on July 1, 2030. Or a state action exempts the institution based on the institution's accreditation by one or more accrediting agencies recognized by the Secretary, or based on the institution being in operation for at least 20 years, though this exemption shall expire on July 1, 2030. An institution exempt from initial state authorization or licensure requirements under this section that undergoes a change of ownership shall not be exempted from the requirements of 34 CFR 600.20H3 Romanet 2, which requires the institution receive approval for the change of ownership from each state in which the institution is physically located, or for an institution that offers only distance education from the agency that authorizes the institution to legally provide post-secondary education in that state, and B, seek approval for the state authorization. Next, we'll move on to changes under 600.9D. Under 600.9D, we address state authorization requirements for an institution offering distance education in another state through a reciprocity agreement. We move language that was under exemptions to state that the institution may be exempted from initial state authorization or licensure requirements in that state. During session 2, we asked how we might address education-specific laws that we might consider allowing states to enforce if they choose through reciprocity. After considering feedback, we decided that instead of defining which state laws should be allowed to be enforced regardless of reciprocity, we instead focus on which requirements we would consider exempt from enforcing, and to which works towards an institution's benefit in reducing burden through reciprocity. 600.9D2 Romanet 1, we state that a reciprocity agreement must allow any member state of a reciprocity agreement to enforce its own state laws and regulations if it chooses, outside of the initial approval for state authorization, except for authorization and application fees and processes. We welcome negotiator input onto what else we might include in this list of exceptions. We removed language that was duplicative and created some confusion on allowing states to accept, investigate, and resolve complaints. We think that is addressed in the existing language. Finally, we took a modified version of the proposal suggested by several negotiators to require that an institution operating above a particular size threshold within a state be required to go through full authorization in that state. Under 600.9D4, we propose that any institution enrolling more than 500 students in a state participating through reciprocity would be required to undergo authorization in that state. We think there is value in requiring that institutions with a large footprint in a state be subject to state laws. In considering an appropriate threshold, we look to our existing regulations, and 500 students is the threshold we use under our cash management regulations related to Tier 1 arrangements. We welcome negotiator input on that threshold. So before opening up the floor to comments here, a couple things I would like to address regarding questions that we received. The first is that First is what problems, rather, we are trying to address in allowing states the choice to enforce certain laws and how these are different from our original proposal on complaints and governance. The language you see before you is based on those concerns. We stated from the beginning that we are concerned that the structure of reciprocity agreements have shortcomings that fail to protect students and taxpayers and that reduce states' oversight of institutions. This is also not the first time the department has considered this exact problem. Most recently finalized certification procedure rules reflect this as well. After hearing concerns and compelling reasoning from negotiators about how states are limited in enforcing those recently finalized rules, the department is proposing to readdress the issue here. We are trying to balance the goals of ensuring that institutions have a reasonable path to offer distance education to students who do not reside within their borders, by ensuring that institutions are not subject to the most burdensome requirements, while ensuring states have the choice and ability to protect their students where they see appropriate. We are addressing ongoing concerns from some states who have been limited in their ability to apply their own laws and to protect their residents. We've been asked whether our language would disallow SARA's current policies preventing states from enforcing specific requirements. The short answer is no. Our proposal is not specific to SARA or disallowing any such agreement. Ultimately, it will be up to states to make the determination on whether they choose to enforce their specific laws. As mentioned by several negotiators, we expect many, if not most states, to decline to avail themselves of this enforcement option. However, we do think it is important to allow states the ability to enforce their laws if they choose to do so. And we are aware of at least one state legislature that is specifically considering legislation to better enable them to protect their students who are enrolled out of state. On state exemptions, we received one question on the problems we are trying to solve. We received several questions rather on the problem we are trying to resolve. As mentioned in issue paper 1, the department is concerned that existing state authorization regulations, which allow states to exempt certain institutions from state approval and licensure if the institution is accredited by an accreditation agency recognized by the secretary, or if the institution has been in operation for more than 20 years, do not ensure sufficient state oversight of those institutions. State exemptions of certain categories of institutions from approval weaken the program integrity triad for institutions that want to participate in the federal aid programs, making students and taxpayers vulnerable. The department has seen examples of abuses such as misrepresentation that should fall under state authority and enforcement, but currently do not. As a result, students must sue in order to obtain relief. So with that, we'll go back and open the floor for discussion from the negotiators. Thank you.
Eric, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you for the explanations of the position that Department of Ed is currently espousing. I do just want to make one comment. For those of us who are really visual learners, it was hard for me to follow and integrate everything that Greg just said as the rationale for where we are today. And I just want to say, if I ask a question for which you tried to already answer that, I just beg your forbearance on that.
No
I want to
problem.
start with a couple of questions on 600.9A. The existing regulations refer to exemption from state approval or licensing requirements. The proposed ones refer to state authorization or licensing requirements. Could you just comment about that change of terminology? And as you're doing that, just keeping in mind that there is great inconsistency across the triad for using terms like reciprocity, authorization, recognition, certification, approval, license to operate. And perhaps if you talk a little bit more about that or further define, that will be helpful for us to understand the intent on this exemption issue. So that's one.
So we're looking at 600.9, 600.9A3. Is that what you're talking about?
Sorry, I'm a visual learner, so I have to look at my page.
Okay.
And actually-
Could you,
Vanessa,
I'm
could
sorry,
you bring it up on the screen? Sorry. Chris.
yeah, bring up,
It's
bring up 600.9.
600.9.
And the new, there's the new language
Yes,
there.
they're in the middle of the page, state authorization or licensure. And if you scroll down a little, you can see what that replaces is state approval or licensure, where it was in B.
Oh, okay, he's talking about where it say B here. Let's
Well-
just go down and look at, the institution. So that previously read the institution complies with the state approved or licensure requirements, except the state exempt institution from state approval process. Right, we've, and so your specific question is why we put what we did up here in the new language in A3?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, I'm not sure I'm exactly getting at the question. I'm trying to, is there something you don't like about the wording? I'm just trying to get to the gist of what.
I'm just trying to understand the rationale of, I mean, if you're changing a word, there must be a reason that you were changing that word. And I wanted to understand that better. And I guess it goes part to the question, and maybe I should have prefaced it with this. I know this was not resolved, or this was addressed in 2010. And I guess what's the evidence that there have been abuses since 2010 that are based on the schools that were approved or the language of approval or licensed, and now we're switching to authorized or licensed.
Did you have something to say about that? Or?
In my reading of this authorization, I think we were hewing closer to the statutory term. I don't think that we had a substantive reason beyond that. Approval might be read a little more narrowly, but the department did not have in mind that we were altering the kinds of things a state could do here to authorize an institution. I look to my two colleagues here, but I don't believe that was the intent with the wording change.
And we moved the exemptions to a separate section here, so that's
okay.
That's why we made the change here, because we clarified the language surrounding the exceptions and the expiration of those exceptions in a separate section.
And I think Dave's right. The statutory provision says authorized, and in our regulations, and in terms of the definitions of higher education or institutions of higher education, they have to be authorized by the state. So this is just making the conformity to match the regulations and align with the statutory language.
Okay.
But there's not a big difference there. I mean, it's we do in 600.4, 600.5, and 600.6, we refer to state authorization for eligibility. So it does conform more with that language.
And I guess I was in the state of Iowa, for example, my institution is approved to operate in our state by our educational department. So that's why I may be sensitive to that use of authorization versus approved, because in our state, it does have a distinction.
And I think there is a distinction, is maybe what you're getting to in terms of being authorized to operate a business in the state.
No,
versus,
this is to operate as a higher education institution.
All right, so the department, I think, doesn't see a distinction between.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we view those the same way.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I do see that, just want to say that Rob Anderson is in for John Ware representing state officials, and he has his hand up. So Rob, take it away.
Thanks so much. First of all, I want to start with some Dave Mason song in the 70s. There ain't no good guy, there ain't no bad guy. We just disagree. And I think there's some of that going on here. And so some of these issues are big. They're tectonic plate shifting type of big. This isn't just discussions over a word or two, you know, like the 500 that we need to change, but I think just some fundamental philosophical differences about this moving forward. And so, you know, first of all, Greg, I would love to get the comments you made at the outset of this. I think that would be helpful. It looked as if you had them written down, and I don't know if there's any way before tomorrow we could take a look at that, because as was stated earlier, I'm a little more visual, and just having that might spur some questions, or they might eliminate others tomorrow. But anyway, if we could get that, that would be great. You use the language uses the term applicable state laws in a couple of different instances. And what I was wondering is, what does applicable mean here, specifically to you, and who decides what is applicable? Is it the education department, a state, the organization administering the reciprocity agreement?
In this context, we, and I'll ask for correction from my people if we're wrong, but we mean the state, not the organization. It would be this, whatever laws the state deems applicable, they should not be inhibited from enforcing.
Okay.
But I'll ask for Denise to confirm. Denise wants to confirm that, or?
No, that's correct. We're talking about the state, what the state deems applicable for those institutions.
And as far as the 500 figure, I think I heard you mention that it was aligned with the cash management threshold. Is there any reason beyond that was a number that was used for this other thing?
Well, I mean, whenever we deal with you know, imposing a number, it's got to come from, obviously any number is to some extent a settled upon figure, right? In using numbers, we try to use a reasonable figure, and we look to other regulations that we have. As we pointed out, this the 500 threshold comes from 668 164F, which is the tier 2, which is tier 2 arrangements. So we got the number from.
Okay,
but it's a, you know, we deem it to be a reasonable number to have chosen for, you know, as a threshold for this. I'm sorry, Denise.
No, I'm just going to I was trying to jump in, but so I think, Rob, we were looking at a presence in the state, right, and what would be reasonable, and we were scouring our regs and to see if there was any other places where we define that, and we looked at the cash management regs and that deemed that to be a reasonable number. But I think, as Greg mentioned, we're open to other, you know, numbers with a rational basis, a reasonable basis behind them.
Yeah, and you know what I'm having trouble parsing, and then I'll be quiet for now. There's plenty to say later. Is, you know, it was stated in earlier comments, try not to undermine the state's rights, and just this line between saying we don't want to undermine a state's rights, but if it gets above that limit, then we're going to, what would be, in my estimation, micromanage the process. We are going to undermine those states' rights and decisions that they have made along the way in being part of this reciprocity agreement. So I'm just having trouble reconciling those two sides of it. And that's why I say, I think we have some philosophical differences that are pretty significant when it comes to this, but I'll be quiet for now, but thank you.
Denise, I see your hand.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm muting myself again. But I think you got to understand, Rob, we're trying to weigh the balancing between the students and the taxpayer and the states. And I don't think anybody thinks that coming up with the threshold where the institutions have to get direct authorization actually undermines the state's authority. And we have to balance, and also have to balance that with the students and the taxpayer and the integrity of the programs. So that's the department's job here.
Okay, thank you, Denise. Let's see, I see Jillian's hand up.
Thanks. I think I have two questions. First, I just want to clarify what I think I heard, which is the all applicable state laws and regulations means literally like every law that the state would think applies to higher ed in general. Is that what I just want to make sure I'm understanding?
That's correct.
Okay, so if that's the case, then I'm trying to understand how, because I think that married with the 500 student language, I think the way that I'm reading those two together then means that larger institutions would just not be exempted from paperwork. Is that right? So everybody, all online institution, okay, so Robin's shaking her head, so I think I got that right. So all online institutions would be subject to state laws, but large institutions would have to do the paperwork, but smaller institutions would not. So can somebody explain to me how that's a consumer protection? I'm not being snarky, I'm actually just asking that question because I don't understand how the paperwork equals consumer protection.
Well, whereas schools, Denise, I think Denise just addressed that point earlier. Where a school's presence in a state is that it exceeds those numbers. That at that point we believe it's in the best interest of students and the integrity of the programs to have the program directly authorized by that state.
Okay.
David, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So I would argue it's not just paperwork. There are different individuals who are approving the institution when the state itself has to complete the approval process for institutions in this proposal that have a larger presence in the state. That is a substantive difference, and it essentially puts the onus on the actual state whose students are being taught by the institution to affirmatively approve the institution to operate there. So I think that's the real desire with that change.
And in states where there's not currently a process, I understand, I think maybe about half of states don't currently have sort of a process for what you're creating here. Would be interested to hear sort of the department's thoughts or openness on what a runway would be here. I mean, and what happens to those students in states where maybe the state doesn't have a process? Are they just not able to complete their program? Can you speak a little bit about that?
So you're talking about where a state would be required to where the threshold's exceeded and the
Yep, and they maybe don't have a process, or their process is so long that schools will not be able to comply by the timeline that these rules would go into effect. What happens to those students?
We didn't.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Denise. I was going to say we didn't have a runway provision here, but we would be willing to entertain what that might look like.
Right,
And
we would be willing to accept suggestions on the runway time, what is reasonable for those states. But just like other situations where rules have changed over the years, Jillian, the department is conscious of students that are already in a program or students that are enrolling in it. Like, we've tried to always put runways in so that students that aren't harmed that are currently in. So we would definitely look at a runway. We didn't think about putting it in at the time, but we would be open to that and are open to suggestions. But we certainly don't want to harm students that are already in programs and they just be out of luck. That's not the way the department has operated, and we don't intend to operate that way here.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, Caroline, I see your hand up.
Oh, thanks. So also a couple of points. One is in connection with the number of what the threshold for students, should appropriately be. The department has suggested 500, and we think that number might be a bit high because we actually were able to dig into the data a little bit to determine like really how many schools and sort of what percentage of schools actually have that kind of large footprint. And it's actually not a very high number of schools that have such a big footprint. We put some of this data in a submission that was circulated a little bit earlier. And I think it's interesting to see that the chart that we had just looks at, that we circulated, just looks at how many students are in exclusively distance education in another state from where the school is located. But it doesn't look at in each state. So for example, schools that have more than 500 students online in other states are actually, according to the data that we looked at, only around 8% of all institutions, but that's actually more than the number of students that would be affected by this threshold, because that means that, that would be all states. They would look at 500 in each state, not 500 total, if that makes sense. I don't think I'm doing a great job articulating it, but my point is that there's not a lot of schools that actually would meet this threshold in the world of schools. And then also, I just wanted to just quickly add on to what the department was saying, but also to respond a little bit to Jillian's question about what is the big deal? Like, why do we care about schools filing paperwork in states? And part of the issue that I don't think has been talked about has to do with state resources for enforcement. So like if you have an authorization requirement, there's also usually a fee requirement. And so if you're requiring a school that has, let's say you have 20,000 online students in that state, then the oversight of that school would fall onto that state, but you also want them to have to be able to, have the resources for the oversight. So to have that happen, you need direct authorization. That's one other reason why we think this makes sense.
Okay, I see a couple hands up. Thank you for the comment. I just want to make a quick announcement that public comment will begin at 3:30 Eastern. So for those making public comments, please make sure the name that you log in is the same name that you used when you registered, and please log on 15 minutes prior to 3:30 and you'll be put in a virtual waiting room. All right, let's see. I see John Ware is back in for state officials, and you have the floor.
Thanks. Yeah, I have a lot of questions about how you count the 500, but I don't think it's going to matter because the way, with all the changes being proposed, I don't see how reciprocity is really even going to be a thing anymore, because we would the states would essentially have to either rewrite the current reciprocity agreement or come up with an entirely new reciprocity agreement to incorporate all these changes. In addition, most states would have to go back and repass laws. I know in Ohio, our law that was passed was specifically based on the state authorization current reciprocity agreement, and reference the compacts and their control and how things are currently run through the compacts. So we'd have to go back and revise that. A lot of other states would be. And again, writing the reciprocity agreement in the first place was a 2, 3, 4 year process. Multiple states, the Council of State Governments was involved. So, I mean, with the current changes that are being proposed, including changes to the governance structure and the requirement that states be allowed to enforce their own laws, which again, that doesn't really sound like reciprocity, but I think, I don't know what the value would be for institutions to participate, number one, and really for states as well, because if, and getting back to what Jillian said, if I'm going to be required to or if I'm going to enforce my laws against other out-of-state institutions, I'm going to want those institutions to fill out my paperwork because I need to get the information from them in order to be able to enforce my laws. So I don't know why I would waive paperwork requirements if I'm actually going to have to, or if I'm going to enforce laws against the schools. I would need them to fill out my application to have the paperwork requirements. So, again, I understand what the department's trying to do here, but I think this is so far, would change the reciprocity agreement so substantially that I don't think institutions and or states are going to want to participate under what's being proposed currently.
Thank you. Erica, I see your hand up.
I'd be a +1 to John Ware. Thank you for articulating that. I do have a real pragmatic question. I'm trying to think through of what this actually looks like in implementation if we were to get that far. But how would an out-of-state institution know if a state has chosen to enforce or not enforce their state laws?
Well, I don't think we envisioned a formal process with that. I mean, any time a state chose to to do that, that's what this entails. We're not requiring states to do anything here. We're just enabling them to enforce the laws they have. We're talking about these are laws that it deems to be applicable. Meaning the state has not changed its law to specifically exempt an institution or group of institutions. So I'm not sure what you mean. Like, if the school chooses to, you envisioning some kind of a formal process where where the state indicates that. And I mean, one thing I think somewhere else I'm having some difficulty here with is that we're not mandating that states do anything here with respect to enforcing their laws. It's where the state chooses to enforce their laws, they will have the authority to do so.
But I also think I heard you say, I think I heard it, again, it's something you read, was that you don't expect that a lot of the states would necessarily choose to do that. And again, my question is, then if I have 5 students enrolled in Ohio, how do I know whether Ohio, or if I have 505 students in Ohio, whatever, how would I know whether or not Ohio was choosing to require me to have the tuition refund amount set aside? I don't remember what the term of that is, but.
Dave, did you want to make a point here?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Is it okay?
I'm sorry. Well, I was when Dave had his hand up.
Please
Go
ahead.
Go ahead, Carolyn, before I go.
No, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead if you wanted to address it.
So I wanted to say one quick thing. I see some comments coming in the chat that, well, they're asking 2 different things, but I actually think some of this might be related. One of the questions was, why does the department use the word applicable before state laws, since aren't all state laws applicable? And other comments were asking questions around what exactly were we doing with this language, if as it seems we are requiring states to authorize all of these programs. So I just wanted to be clear that the intent behind the word applicable is that the state has actually decided to make the law applicable in its legal language to an institution or a group of institutions. So, for example, if a state says in its laws that have been passed by the state that the institutions in this that are in this reciprocity agreement are not subject to laws 1, 2, and 3, those laws 1, 2, and 3 are not applicable to the institution, whereas they are applicable to a number of other institutions. So states still have the ability to outline in their laws which institutions are exempt from these requirements. What the department is doing elsewhere is saying that the simply joining a reciprocity agreement and saying we're not going to enforce these laws that are on the books is not permitted. I just want to make that as a key point. So states have to make affirmative decisions about how they're going to participate in these agreements.
Okay, thanks, Dave.
And going back to the issue of states apprising entities of their laws, I mean, I can see that, yes, there is a legitimate concern of how would schools be apprised of which laws states deemed applicable. However, I would point out that's a state process, not a federal process. We are through these regulations, we would be enabling states to enforce those applicable laws. The department does not enforce those laws; the states do. So it would be that would be a matter of state concern how it telegraph that to institutions with students in their state.
see Robin's hand up.
Thanks. I wanted to just respond to Erica's question. I think the question isn't whether states are enforcing their laws. Every single business that does any business in any state needs to research and find out which state laws they're applicable to. If they have to comply with licensing laws, then they need to comply with those laws. There may be other types of laws that are applicable, but schools already do this that have brick and mortar campuses. They have to figure out which laws that they have to comply with, and then they comply with them. It would be the same for online institutions. If you're doing, business anywhere in any state, you need to find out what laws you have to comply with that are defined to specifically apply to your business and comply with those laws. So I'm hoping that's answering your question.
It doesn't, because we're not just talking about, I am a brick and mortar institution. Before reciprocity became available for our school, a medical institution, I had $100,000 in my budget to work through just the process of figuring out if, in what states, and going through the process of getting approved in those states. And so it's not a matter of, we could do that. It's a matter of, is that the best place to spend $100,000? And again, that's knowing that there were a bunch of states we didn't have to do anything in. And so if we're talking about balancing, I think we just need to balance where that money's coming from. Where did Des Moines University get the money to put in my budget so that I could pay a fee to the state of Wisconsin and go through a multi-month approval process in order to have some students do our master's degree in mass hospital administration program? Is that the best way for us to have spent $8,000 in that state and $15,000 in this state and $12,000 in another state and $3,000 in another state, plus the time? That's the balancing act. That money comes from tuition. It comes from our diverting funds away from things like a student aid. So I just want there to be really clear that this is not a institutional burden in the sense of, so sad for me, I have to spend a lot of time doing paperwork. It has practical implications for how we have what resources schools have to use for students and in their best interest.
Okay, and I'd like to respond. First of all, I think the department is saying that schools that enroll a certain number of students can get reciprocity and be exempted from having to go through every state's authorization process. So I just want to be clear. I think that's what the department's saying, that schools that fall under that threshold, which now is 500, that they would be exempt if they could join a state reciprocity agreement. And if they do so, they can rely on the approvals of the home state. So I think that's really important. And number two, I understand it's a burden to institutions, but it's also really important to remember we are talking about students and taxpayers, and we're not necessarily talking about public institutions or for-profit. We're talking about for-profit institutions that have a long history of being extremely risky investments to students, whether they're online or not online. That's the problem. And states, that want to protect their students should be able to do so and not hamstrung by an agreement that won't let them do that. And that's where we're at. So I understand this is a burden on institutions, but lots of businesses manages to do business in multiple states, and brick and mortar institutions have done it for a very long time. So there shouldn't be a reason that online institutions can't do the same thing.
Hey, real quick, just want to make a little announcement. We have two hands up. I see Barmack and I see Rob Anderson back in for John Ware. I know public comments coming at 3:30, so these will be the last two comments before the public comment. Doesn't mean there won't be comments, because we'll pick up again tomorrow. But I just wanted to let everybody know that for now. So Barmack, take it away.
It's more of an observation about Erica's comment. The reason your institution doesn't have physical presence in all 50 states, I assume, is that you have judged it uneconomical to lease buildings and go through the processes, including finding out what the applicable minimum wage in each state may be, in order to set up shop in all of them. There is a kind of an undertone in this whole conversation. Just because the internet enables institutions to now hop around the entire country, that regulatory costs are just inherently unreasonable and unnecessary expenses. And I don't know where that assumption comes from, particularly given the history of what we know about the internet. Folks, it is easier to rip people off on the internet than it is to do so in person. Online students need more protection, not less protection. They need better regulations, not weaker regulations. So somehow the assumption that the state may have specific authorization requirements that you may find uneconomical in some cases, that somehow that keeping an institution out of a state in which offering certain courses in compliance with state rules is uneconomical is inherently unfair and unjust. And that is simply not true. Regulatory compliance is a reasonable component of the expense of running any kind of an enterprise in a well-regulated state. And, you know, in some cases, it's worth spending $8,000 and you will spend it. And in other cases, it's not and you shouldn't spend it. That's a judgment each institution can make for itself. And somehow the notion that if it were that if you didn't spend that $8,000, all of that money would, of course, inherently either reduce tuition or improve something else for students is just not supported by any kind of a reasonable assessment of how operations work. So, look, state authorization is a requirement, compliance is a requirement, and institutions should make their own judgments. Just because they can deliberate in an unregulated setting doesn't mean we should deregulate everything and have a free-for-all.
Thank you, Barmack. We're down to about 3 minutes. So Rob, up?
Yeah, I'm still up. Yeah.
Okay, Rob, just to know if your hands went up or down. Go ahead, Rob.
Sorry. Yeah, I'll make this quick. First of all, I feel like I make this observation every month, and it's just one of those differences and those philosophical shifts that would need to take place. Is one, states can carry out and enforce their laws, but not within a reciprocity agreement like this. If you don't want to abide by what the agreement is, you just kind of remove yourself and you don't choose to participate in this reciprocity agreement. Maybe there's another one you do, since this isn't just focused on Sarah. So just to make that observation, but also within this context, something that I'm curious about is with all that's going on the DEI front, and I think more states are going to get really involved in dictating maybe within their own education laws what can and can't be taught, what is seen as stifling speech or going outside of bounds. What if you have one particular state, that wants to enforce their laws about what they consider to be divisive concepts, and it's the exact opposite of the other hosting state, and a student's in a class, and how do you enforce that, or how would you see this playing out should that home state say, nope, that absolutely can't be taught, it falls outside of what we consider as allowable within our education-specific law.
Thanks, Rob. Scott, we have like about less than a minute. Can you make your comment a minute, or do you want to hold it for tomorrow?
I'll hold it for tomorrow. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Appreciate it. Okay, we're just coming up on 3:30, which is the public comment. And Brady, who do we have up first?
All right, I'll admit our first speaker, who is Bob Carey, who's the director of the National Defense Committee. And
Hi, Bob. Welcome. Can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes. Welcome to public comment. You have 3 minutes to speak. You'll be given notice when you have 30 seconds remaining, and your 3 minutes begins when you start speaking. You
Okay. Am I going to be? I'm waiting though to start up, right?
You could, whenever you're ready to start, you can go ahead.
Oh, okay, great. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. Appreciate joining your negotiated rulemaking committee. Got a couple things I need to talk about. One, look, I'm a retired Navy captain. National Defense Committee works on military and veteran legal and civil rights, and we think that one of the most important elements of that is the freedom to use earned educational benefits as we see fit. That's the thing about the GI Bill. It's not like a scholar. It's not like my ROTC scholarship when I was in ROTC. It's an earned educational benefit. I had to sign on for 6 more years in order to be able to get that. And and to then have the Department of Education and the Department of Veterans Affairs exercise what fundamentally looks like condescending paternalism towards us and say, you can use your educational benefits here, you cannot use your educational benefits here, and this is how you have to use your educational benefits, is just, you're infantilizing the military and veteran students. Most specifically on this one that you're discussing now about online and virtual education. First, I'm deeply concerned that at the same time the Department of Education Negotiated Rulemaking Committee is discussing this, the Department of Veterans Affairs is doing the exact same thing, but in a different way. So to the extent that the Department of Education is talking about standardizing this, how is that not going to be unstandard, or I guess that's a word, non-standard from what the Department of Veterans Affairs is doing? You're just introducing more confusion. The other element is, as Ms. Morelli discussed, and as others discussed as well, we seem to be penalizing the 95, 98% that abide for the 2 to 5% that don't. And if things are really as bad as you say they are, and there's these, and essentially this is a false claim on the part of these schools and on the part of the students. Where's the Key Tam lawsuit? Where's the False Claims Act lawsuit? Where's the prosecution? There was just an announcement today of charges, RICO Act charges being brought against someone for Medicare fraud with the Veterans Health Administration. Why aren't you doing the same thing here?
30 seconds.
Thank you. Rather than going after the students and the schools that are doing the right thing. I went to the Naval War College in a virtual method. Looking at your regulation, I don't believe that my going to the Naval War College would have met the requirements that the department is putting together. Sounds to me like you guys need to go back to the drawing board on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Brady, who we have up next?
All right, I just submitted Mary Beth Bigley, who's here representing the National Organization of Nurse Practitioner Facilities, or faculties, apologies. And I believe she is connected in the room.
Hi, Mary Beth, can you hear us?
We can hear you.
Okay, you'll have 3 minutes to speak. You'll be given notice when you have 30 seconds remaining, and your 3 minutes begins when you begin speaking. You have the floor.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Mary Beth Bigley, and I'm the CEO of the National Organization of Nurse Practitioner Faculties, NOF. We represent over 95% of nurse practitioner programs. On behalf of NOF, I am asking this committee to conduct a review of current standards set forth by accreditation bodies to ensure that full adoption of industry standards. Additionally, I request consideration for stronger language in CFR 602 to ensure that industry standards are adopted by nursing accreditation agencies. NOF is devoted to promoting high-quality nurse practitioner education. A nurse practitioner is a registered nurse with advanced education. As a licensed autonomous practitioner, a nurse practitioner diagnoses, prescribes, and manages acute and chronic conditions. In fact, a recent CMS study reported that 40% of Medicare patients are treated by nurse practitioners. NOF convened a national task force to review and update a document titled Standards for Quality Nurse Practitioner Education. This nationally esteemed expert task force was comprised of 19 national organizations. Last updated and endorsed by the task force in 2022, these academic standards are to ensure that education preparations aligns with increasing complexity of our healthcare system. It is expected that NP programs comply with these standards as part of accreditation and to assure that we have a ready practiced graduate. However, nursing education accreditation bodies have self-selected only a few of these industry standards. Most recently, the Commission for Collegial Nursing Education, who accredits most of the nurse practitioner program, has made a decision for the first time to join this trend and not fully adopt this industry standard. NOF holds the position by not adopting these industry standards, all nursing accreditation agencies are in violation of CFR 602, which specifically states standards must be sufficiently rigorous, recommends that widely recommended industry standards are met, and that programs maintain requirements that at least are conform to accepted academic standards. The impact of inaction by this committee will result in some nurse practitioner programs not adopting these nationally endorsed quality standards, which may impact patient safety and worsen patient outcomes. Therefore, NAF asks the committee to conduct a review of nursing accreditation agencies to ensure they fully adopt standards
30 seconds.
such as the standards for quality nurse practitioner education, and also to strengthen the language for CFR Part 602 to ensure industry standards are developed by the experts or adopted by the agency. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comment.
Thank you, Dr. Bigley. All right, Brady, who do we have up next?
All right, I just submitted Jeremy Bauer Wolf, who's here representing New America. I believe he is in the room.
Jeremy, can you hear us?
I can.
All right, welcome. You have 3 minutes to speak. You'll be given notice when you have 30 seconds remaining, and your 3 minutes begins when you begin speaking. You have the floor.
Great, thank you very much. My name is Jeremy Bauer-Wolf. I'm the investigations manager with New America's higher education team. We focus our work on creating a higher education system that is accessible, affordable, equitable, and accountable for helping students lead fulfilling and economically secure lives. We're glad to see this committee working to improve higher education regulations. We urge you to continue moving toward rules that prevent poorly performing programs from wasting students' time and money. Over the past 3 weeks, one recurring theme from some negotiators has been to question what problems stronger accreditation regulations intend to solve. Unfortunately, there are many recent examples of institutional failures that have harmed students and cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars, which could have been prevented by stricter accreditor oversight. Improved regulations and better accreditor management could have prevented or at least minimized failures at institutions like Ashford, Corinthian, and the University of Phoenix. And again, these are just a few of the examples of many. We encourage the committee to preserve rules on minimum quality standards that accreditors can set, better oversight of substantive changes, and stricter requirements around teach-out agreements. We also welcome stricter oversight of institutions that pose a greater risk of failure. Additionally, we urge the committee to maintain proposals that would require more independent members of accrediting agency boards. This will help ensure agency boards are not oversaturated with industry representatives. In addition to stronger accreditation rules, we're glad to see improvements to cash management, return of Title IV funds, distance education, and state authorization. On cash management, we're concerned that focusing solely on refunding students for unspent cash value funds will create a loophole for meal vouchers, which could still represent a significant loss for students. And so we urge the department to consider including the cash value of meal vouchers in this proposal, as well as cash equivalent funds. In the state authorization proposals, the requirement that an institution must obtain permission directly from any state where it enrolls over 500 students is an improvement. However, we urge the department to consider whether a lower number of students may be appropriate. Initial analysis by our team suggests a lower threshold of 100 students would be more fitting and would still only capture a minority of students that enroll students in multiple states. Thank you to the committee for your time and your consideration.
Thank you, Jeremy. All right, Brady, who do we have next?
All right, I just submitted Betsy Talbot, who's here representing herself.
Okay.
Am I supposed to start talking?
Oh, Betsy, can you hear?
Yes, I can. I didn't know. Sorry, I was clicking on the computer audio.
Oh, that's okay. Welcome. You have 3 minutes to speak. You'll be given notice when you have 30 seconds remaining. And your 3 minutes begins when you begin speaking. You have the floor. Take it away.
Sorry, so I'm supposed to start speaking?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Thank you for your time today. My name is Betsy Talbot, and I've worked full-time as a state regulator for approximately 9 years. Today, I'm speaking on behalf of my experiences and not on behalf of my employer. Within the triad, states are expected to be responsible for the legal and regulatory framework that maintains educational integrity and consumer protection for students. It's well recognized that each state has its own framework for this work, but it has been my experience that the lens of this work is seen through politics of consumer protections. Politics directly impact the depth and breadth of protections afforded to students and the resources made available to regulators to facilitate this work. Politics, the threat of litigation, financial resources, and data sharing laws impact my ability as a regulator to speak forthrightly about my experiences and having the tools to detect many of the consumer protections discussed during this rulemaking process. It has not been my experience that states act intentionally and directly to safeguard Title IV financial aid or have any consistency in minimum consumer protections. The lack of consistency of consumer protections or state authorization application processes was the driver of the current state authorization reciprocity structure. Under this current structure, schools have benefited from increased access to new student enrollments, lower regulatory costs and fees, and fewer administrative barriers. Students have also benefited from increased access to schools of their choice, but that access has come at a cost of fewer resources being available and directed towards the oversight of colleges and the detection of nefarious activities. It has reduced the potential remedies for students due to those nefarious activities, and has created a shift of who's driving the conversation of consumer protections for distance education. The current structures of the National Reciprocity Agreement does not afford the same checks and balances as a public legislative or rulemaking process, and has also dramatically changed the representation of who is a state actor, and there is no voice for students and consumer protection allies. I encourage the department to consider impacts on this rulemaking process that one, creates increased expectations of state authorization to perform safeguarding of Title IV aid on behalf of the U.S. Department of Education, creates an incentive for states to reduce state authorization requirements and consumer protections to be eligible for participation in a reciprocity agreement, or create any structure where states are expected to perform consumer protection functions when those financial resources necessary will not be the priority of that state. Thank you for your time today, and I really appreciate the chance to speak.
Thank you for your comment. Brady, who do we have next?
All right, next we are hearing from Alastair Adam, who is the co-CEO of Flatworld.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Welcome. You have 3 minutes to speak. You'll be given notice when you have 30 seconds remaining, and your 3 minutes will begin when you start speaking. So take it away. You have the floor.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take us back to February 5th and cash management and focus on one subtle but very important concession, which considerably but hopefully inadvertently strengthens the hand of bookstore monopolies. It relates to providing a way for students who are eligible for Title IV funds to obtain or purchase those materials by the 7th day of the payment period. Stepping back, monopolists don't have a good track record of doing right by consumers, students included. Inclusive access deals grant bookstores effective monopolies on books and materials at each school. Preferential Title IV disbursement rules strengthen those monopolies. The consolidation of bookstore companies and online distributors is then accelerating anti-competitive behavior and the blocking of more affordable alternatives, and we see that every day. Mr. Martin was asked, if an institution provides a student with the option to opt in, have we met this requirement? And both Mr. Martin and Mr. Musser affirmed yes. But allowing schools to grant the bookstore this preferential treatment for disbursement of funds is the only way for a student to receive their money in time to purchase books before the start of class is a nightmare for student affordability. To reiterate the importance of this concession, investors in bookstore stocks trumpeted the specific concession made during those negotiations as making Barnes & Noble exponentially more valuable. Many students simply can't afford to cover the out-of-pocket costs of their materials without these disbursements. And therefore, any student who finds materials more cheaply elsewhere faces an invidious choice: pay the inflated bookstore price now, or wait for delayed disbursements after classes have started when institutions get around to releasing funds. In many cases, these inflated prices are tucked away, compounding in loans that the students will be paying off for decades to come. Luckily, there's a relatively simple drafting solution, I believe, to this problem. Add the wording that funds must be provided by the 7th day for purchase from a supplier of the student's choosing. Bookstores tout the first day access provided by IAA auto opt-in deals as though it's the only solution for timely access to materials. But in a digital world, it shouldn't require, it doesn't need to require paying 30 to 40% bookstore markups as the price for students to get on-time access to their materials. The broader issue I want to address, though, beyond removing this particular loophole, lies at the heart of all of these discussions. There's an inherent conflict of interest when a school makes more money the more that students spend on textbooks and learning materials. That schools rely on these funds is not in doubt, and if these
30
incentives weren't
seconds remain.
instrumental in tilting the table in favor of bookstores and driving up student spending, I'm certain the companies wouldn't so willingly pay them. That doesn't make them right. It certainly doesn't make them good for students. The simplest solution of all is to outlaw these volume-based rebates and revenue share deals altogether. Remove the conflict, level the playing field, align institutions with students in trying to reduce the cost of materials. They distort behavior. So eliminate the bookstore monopolies on Title IV fund distribution, eliminate the financial linkage, close this critical loophole. Thanks very much.
Thank you for your comment. Brady, who do we have next?
All right, I just submitted Brooke Elliott, who's here on behalf of the University of Illinois, and I believe Brooke is in the room.
I am. Thank you.
Welcome, Brooke. You'll have 3 minutes to speak. You'll be given notice when you have 30 seconds remaining, and your 3 minutes begins when you start speaking. You have the floor. Take it away.
Thank you. My name is Brooke Elliott, and I'm the Executive Associate Dean of Academic Programs in the Keys College of Business at the University of Illinois. Our campus community has significant concerns about several of the proposed changes outlined. Specifically, the proposed changes concerning state authorization reciprocity would have far-reaching negative consequences for distance education and the broader landscape of higher education. By removing the uniformity of oversight across member states, these changes threaten to disrupt the efficient functioning of educational institutions and compromise the quality of education provided to students. University of Illinois distance education programs currently serve over 8,000 learners across all 50 states and from around the world. Distance education provides a pivotal role in expanding access to education for underserved and marginalized communities. Restricting the ability of institutions to offer these programs across state lines would severely limit educational opportunities, exacerbating existing disparities in access and attainment. One of the primary concerns with the proposed changes is the potential for increased administrative burden and regulatory complexity. Moreover, the proposed changes undermine the principles of collaboration and cooperation that underpin the reciprocity agreement framework. Thus, the Department of Education risks fragmenting the higher education landscape and eroding the trust and cooperation among member states. We also have concerns regarding the proposed changes to the treatment of Title IV funds. While it is essential to ensure accountability and fiscal responsibility in the administration of federal financial aid programs, the proposed modifications will inadvertently create barriers for students seeking to access higher education. We disagree that taking attendance in distance education programs would simplify application of the last day of attendance rule, which already holds online learners to a higher engagement standards than those enrolled in our on-campus courses. Mandating our faculty to maintain additional attendance records for every student is not simplifying. Moreover, it is unclear how attendance tracking would be achieved in asynchronous online courses. Moreover, equitable application of the department's 14-day drop requirement poses challenges. For one, it is not uncommon for online students to stop out for 2 weeks and still successfully finish courses. Just as on-campus students may face unforeseen circumstances necessitating a temporary break from coursework, online students should not be penalized for facing similar challenges. In fact, many learners pursuing online education choose this modality precisely because of the flexibility that the modality provides. At the University of Illinois, our online program student populations are more diverse in background, race, ethnicity, and experiences because we've removed many of the traditional barriers of pursuing high-quality education. This diversity creates a richer learning environment and is one of the key markers of the quality educational experience in our programs. In essence, the proposed changes overlook the complexity of online education and fail to recognize the diverse needs and circumstances of learners that we are striving to serve. We strongly urge the Department of Education to reconsider these proposed changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooke. Brady, who do we have up next?
All right, I just admitted Robert Boyd, who's here on behalf of Independent Colleges and Universities of Florida. I believe Bob is in the room.
Yes, thank you.
All right, welcome. Welcome.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to speak about the proposed rule on the state authorization exemption regarding accreditation status. Again, I'm Bob Boyd. I'm President and CEO of ICUF, the Independent Colleges and Universities of Florida. We're 31 institutions, 175,000 students, all nonprofit, all SACS, COC regionally accredited, 4-year chartered in Florida. So what I wanted to say was this proposed rule does not help achieve your goal of protecting students. In fact, it does the opposite. We think it jeopardizes Title IV funding, financial aid for the most vulnerable students in the ICUF sector. So the rule on state authorization eliminating the accreditation exception, that would be our position, and here's why. The ICUF schools are exempt from licensure in Florida by from the CIE, which is the Commission for Independent Education. This is a for-profit higher ed board. Because of our SAC COC regional accreditation and because we are EASE eligible, which is our access grant, this was done in a huge fight in the 80s, over 40 years ago. It saved us fees and relieved us from burdensome, unnecessary regulation. But the most important thing to remember here is even though we're exempt from licensure, we still have to report to the state and to the public. Let me just give you an example. Fiscal plant safety, credit transferability, refund policies to prospective students, job placement services, professional licensure requirements. We have to follow requirements for advertising. We have to report crime statistics. And this is key, student complaints reporting and procedures. Then on top of that, they've added over the years, we've got to do foreign gift reporting. We have to report on our bathroom policy. You can imagine the things we have to report to Florida. But we essentially give a fair consumer report to the state of Florida annually, and we've got to do that every single year and update the data. So our position is there's no need to change the state authorization because it's completely separate from the state regulation in Florida protecting student consumers. And all this proposed language does is it forces us into the CIE. Our fees would go up over $10,000 a year per institution. It would create new duplicative regulations, for example, like site visits, which SACS already does. And the CIE, in my conversations with them, have told me they don't have the
30
staff,
seconds, Bob.
okay, nor the ability, nor the desire to add all the students. Finally, I would say Florida may not pass this legislation. I don't think they would. That would jeopardize the Title IV funds for all of our ICUF students. And so please, we would ask you not to change the state authorization language, which again is separate from state regulatory action protecting students. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate your comment. Who do we have next, Brady?
All right, I just submitted David Tretter, who's here on behalf of the Federation of Independent Illinois Colleges and Universities. And David's in the room.
Can you hear me, David?
I can.
All right, you have 3 minutes to speak. You'll be given notice when you have 30 seconds remaining, and your 3 minutes begins when you start speaking. You have the floor.
Great, thank you for the opportunity. Dave Tretter with the Federation of Independent Colleges, a advocacy organization here in Illinois, represent 56 nonprofit colleges and universities throughout the state, educating over 200,000 students annually, larger than our public universities here. Illinois' nonprofits here are the leading producers of teachers, engineers, medical doctors, disease researchers here in Illinois, and we're proud of our over 150-year record of higher education. I appear today to express my grave concerns, our grave concerns on behalf of the Illinois nonprofit colleges and universities in relation to proposed changes on program integrity and institutional quality that would eliminate some current regulations that exempt institutions from in-state approval or licensure. In addition to, I think, some other proposals that we view as harmful. It's unclear, at least in the information I've been provided over the last couple of weeks, what ailment we're trying to cure here, but I can tell you if enacted that these changes, and you may have heard this from my colleagues across the country, will create what I think is legislative chaos in the states, not only in Illinois, but many other states, and seem to target, in my opinion, our finest and longest serving institutions in the country with, frankly, I think some of the best track record of good and high quality higher education, leading to jobs, et cetera, that I think we're all interested in. Let me just end with, as I look at the provisions laid out, I think at a minimum, this certainly there's some questions about federal authority over the states here, and I think, and you're hearing it today, I suspect, some pushback on what I would view as an overreach of federal authority, and I sincerely hope that is relooked at, reconsidered, and that efforts are made to reach out to the states, including Illinois, so that we can work with you to find a better solution. That's all I got. Thank you for the time today.
Thank you for your comment, David. Appreciate it. Brady, who do we have next?
All right, we are hearing from Hope Williams now, who's here representing the North Carolina Independent Colleges and Universities.
Good afternoon.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Welcome. You have 3 minutes to speak. You'll be given notice when you have 30 seconds remaining, and your 3 minutes begins when you start speaking. You have the floor.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. I am Hope Williams, President of North Carolina Independent Colleges and Universities, the statewide office of North Carolina's private higher education sector. And I'm here today to address the issue of state authorization in relation to eligibility for our students to receive Title IV funds. When the Higher Education Act was passed by Congress in 1965, North Carolina's 36 private liberal arts and research colleges and universities had long been authorized by the state. Many had been conferring undergraduate, graduate, and professional degrees for more than 100 years. This relationship with the state and the pre-existing state authorization was why, when the North Carolina General Assembly consolidated public universities under one governing board in 1971, the legislature also exempted our private nonprofit colleges and universities from licensure by the public system's then newly established Board of Governors. A state's process for authorization of colleges and universities and the separate state licensure requirements or exemption from licensure granted by state law have been recognized since the inception of the Higher Education Act. Only in 2010 did the U.S. Department of Education start questioning that state's authority. At that point, our office researched state statutes and other official state documents to prove the state authorization of each of our colleges and universities. There is a sense of deja vu today, although nothing has changed since those discussions in 2010 in terms of the authorization of our institutions by the state or the state remedies that students have for issues they cannot resolve at the institutional level. Regardless of the number of years colleges have operated in a state or how the state recognizes the college by name or in another manner in state law or in other state documents, it is deeply concerning that administrative regulation would be poised to try to discount, even supersede, state law on state authorization passed by the state's elected officials. Such a change after almost 60 years would cause tremendous upheaval for thousands of students attending our independent colleges and universities and receiving federal financial aid which is absolutely critical to the ability of these students to attend and graduate from college. Almost half of North Carolina students attending our 36 independent colleges and universities receive Pell Grants, a percentage that is higher than in our and many other public university systems. Each of these North Carolina Pell Grant recipients, under the auspices of the governor and the North Carolina General Assembly, also receives state need-based financial aid. The fact that the General Assembly provides the state support to students attending our colleges and universities is further confirmation of our state authorization. The final point I will make today is to ask you to reflect carefully about the mixed message you will be sending on state authorization if you implement what is being proposed.
Time is up.
The U.S. Department of Education would be telling states that it recognizes a state's legal right and authority by virtue of the state's funding of 2- and 4-year.
All right, Brady, who do we have as our last scheduled speaker?
Our final speaker is Thomas Foley, who is here representing the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities of Pennsylvania. He is in the room. He just needs to come off of mute. It looks like he can hear us, but someone needs to unmute him on. See someone working in the background.
Can you hear us okay?
We can. I think what you might need to do is mute it, because I think you're logged in under 2 devices. If you just want to mute it on one of them, so otherwise we'll get a feedback, but we can hear you and see you.
All right, that's super. My name is Tom. Thank you. My name is Tom Foley. I'm president of the Association of Independent Colleges.
Oh, wait, you muted yourself.
Yeah. Independent nonprofit colleges, serving over 275,000 students. I'm here to speak against the department's proposal to eliminate regs that exempt institutions from state approval or licensure requirements for in-state schools if, one, the institution is established by name as an educational institution by a state through a charter, statute, constitutional provision, or other action. And two, state law provides an exemption to institutions based on an institution's accreditation or based on the institution being in operation for at least 20 years. Most of the existing independent nonprofit colleges and universities in Pennsylvania are authorized via a charter from the General Assembly of the Commonwealth. 23 of these institutions were chartered before 1850, 29 more before 1900. All of these institutions have educated students and served their communities for over 100 years and have persisted through a Great Depression, 2 world wars, a Great Recession, and at least 1 worldwide epidemic. This proposed regulation suggests that these same institutions should now suddenly be viewed as neither legitimate nor trustworthy. This proposal to ignore the authority of states to approve institutions of higher education through, quote, charter, statute, constitutional provision, or other action, unquote, is redundant with existing safeguards, unnecessary for institutions with over 100 years of experience, and very likely harmful to students in our state if implemented. All independent nonprofit higher ed institutions in Pennsylvania have to demonstrate their effectiveness to regional accreditors on a regular basis. They're subject to periodic program reviews of their financial aid policies by the Office of Federal Financial Aid, and they must follow numerous consumer protection laws enacted by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the federal government. It is unclear to us what additional education or student protection goals the proposed reg by the department identifies and meets. In 2012, legislation was passed in Pennsylvania that allowed these colleges to implement new degree courses or programs without direct approval from the Pennsylvania Department of Ed, if the college or university had regional accreditation and the institution had been in operation for at least 10 years. The legislature acted because of a 3 to 4 year backlog in the state's department's process for reviewing these applications. This backlog prevented colleges from quickly responding to community and employer needs for trained workers, especially in the areas of STEM, healthcare, and teaching. Unfortunately, that Pennsylvania Department of Ed continues to be both underfunded and understaffed. There's little likelihood that that situation would change absent accompanying federal funding resources to enable it. Individual states are closest to the action. They understand the importance of quick pivots to satisfy educational and workforce needs.
Your time is up.
And they should retain the authority to utilize
Thank you for your comment.
limited exemptions for higher ed authorization to meet the needs of employers and communities.
And with that, excuse me, that brings an end to the public comment portion of the day. And that also means that we're at the end of the day 1, session 3. It's completed. I want to thank everyone for their participation and their hard work and see everyone tomorrow.